present A Murder is Announced by Agatha Christie. Part 1. Between 7:30 and 8:30 every morning except Sundays, Johnny Butt made the round of the village of Chipping Cleghorn on his bicycle, whistling vociferously through his teeth and alighting at each house or cottage to shove through the letterbox such morning papers as had been ordered by the occupants of the house in question from Mr. Totman, stationer, of the High Street. Thus, at Colonel and Mrs. Easterbrook's he delivered the Times and the Daily Graphic. At Mrs. Swettenham's he left the Times and the Daily Worker. At Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd's he left the Daily Telegraph and the News Chronicle. At Miss Blacklock's he left the Telegraph, the Times, and the Daily Mail. At all these houses, and indeed at practically every house in Chipping Cleghorn, he delivered every Friday a copy of the North Benham News and Chipping Cleghorn Gazette, known locally simply as the Gazette. Thus, on Friday mornings, after a hurried glance at the headlines in the daily paper, International Situation Critical, UNO meets today, Bloodhounds seek blonde typist's killer, 3 collieries idle, 23 die of food poisoning in seaside hotel, etc., most of the inhabitants of Chipping Cleghorn eagerly opened the Gazette and plunged into the local news. After a cursory glance at correspondence, in which the passionate hates and feuds of rural life found full play, 9 out of 10 subscribers then turned to the personal column. Here were grouped together higgledy-piggledy articles for sale or wanted, frenzied appeals for domestic help, innumerable insertions regarding dogs, announcements concerning poultry and garden equipment, and various other items of an interesting nature to those living in the small community of Chipping Cleghorn. This particular Friday, October the 29th, was no exception to the rule. Mrs. Swettenham, pushing back the pretty little grey curls from her forehead, opened the Times, looked with a lacklustre eye at the left-hand centre page, decided that, as usual, if there was any exciting news, the Times had succeeded in camouflaging it in an impeccable manner, took a look at the births, marriages and deaths, particularly the latter, then, her duty done, put aside the Times and eagerly seized the Chipping Cleghorn Gazette. When her son Edmund entered the room a moment later, she was already deep in the personal column. "Good morning, dear. The Smedleys are selling their Daimler. 1935. That's rather a long time ago, isn't it?" Her son grunted and poured himself a cup of coffee, helped himself to a couple of kippers, and sat down at the table and opened the Daily Worker, which he propped up against the toast rack. "Bull Mastiff puppies. I really don't know how people manage to feed big dogs nowadays, I really don't. Oh, Selina Lawrence is advertising for a cock again. I could tell her it's just a waste of time advertising these days. And she hasn't put her address, just a box number. That's quite fatal. Servants simply insist on knowing where they're going. They like a good address. False teeth. I can't think why false teeth are so popular. Best prices paid. Beautiful bulbs. Our special selection. Well, they sound rather cheap. Oh, here's a girl wants an interesting post. Would travel. Ha! I dare say she would. Who wouldn't? Dachshunds. Now, I've never really cared for dachshunds myself. Now, I don't mean because they're German, because we've got over all that. I just don't care for them, that's all. Yes, Mrs. Finch. The door had opened to admit the head and torso of a grim-looking woman in an aged velvet beret. "Good morning, Mum. Can I clear?" "Not yet. We haven't finished. Not quite finished," Mrs. Swettenham said ingratiatingly. Casting a look at Edmund and his paper, Mrs. Finch sniffed and withdrew. "I've only just begun," said Edmund, just as his mother remarked. "I do wish you wouldn't read that horrid paper, Edmund. Mrs. Finch does not like it at all." "I don't see my political views have got anything to do with Mrs. Finch." "And it isn't as though you were a worker. You don't do any work at all." "That's not in the least true. I'm writing a book." "I meant real work. And Mrs. Finch does matter, because if she takes a dislike to us and doesn't come in any more, who else are we going to get?" "Advertise in the Gazette." "Just told you, dear, it's no use. Oh, nowadays, unless one has an old nanny in the family who will go into the kitchen and do everything, one is simply sunk. Well, why haven't we got an old nanny? How remiss of you not to have provided me with one. What were you thinking about? You had an ire, dear. No foresight. Mrs. Swettenham was once more deep in the personal column. Second-hand motor mower for sale. Now I wonder. Oh, goodness, what a price! More dachshunds. Do write or communicate. Desperate. Woggles. What silly nicknames people have. Cocker spaniels. Do you remember darling Susie Edmund? Now, she really was human, understood every word you said to her. Sheraton sideboard for sale. Genuine family antique. Mrs. Lucas, Deas Hall. Well, what a liar that woman is! Sheraton, indeed. All a mistake, darling. Undying love. Friday as usual. J. Oh, I suppose they've had a lover's quarrel. Or do you think it's a code for burglars? More dachshunds. Really, I do think people have gone a little crazy about breeding dachshunds. I mean, there are other dogs. Your Uncle Simon used to breed Manchester Terriers. Graceful little things. I do like dogs with legs. Lady going abroad will sell her navy two-piece suiting. No measurements or price given. A marriage is announced. What? No. A murder? Oh, well, I never. Edmund, listen to this. A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October the 29th at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. Friends, please accept this, the only intimation. What an extraordinary thing! Edmund! What? Friday, October the 29th. That's today. Let me see. Her son took the paper from her. What does it mean? Oh, he rubbed his nose doubtfully. It's some sort of party, I suppose. Murder game, that sort of thing. Well, it seems an odd way of doing it. Just sticking it in the advertisements like that. It's not at all like Letitia Blacklock. She always seems a very sensible woman. Probably got up by the bright young things she has in the house. Very short notice, too, today. Do you think we're supposed to go? It says, friends, please accept this, the only intimation. Well, I think these newfangled ways of giving invitations are very tiresome. It's all right, Mother, you needn't go. No. Do you really want that last piece of toast, Edmund? I would have thought my being properly nourished mattered more than letting that old hag clear the table. She'll hear you. What happens to murder game? I don't know, not exactly. I think they pin bits of paper on you or something. Oh, no, I think you draw them out of a hat. Somebody's the victim, someone's a detective. Then they turn the lights out, somebody taps you on the shoulder, you scream and lie down and sham dead. It sounds quite exciting. Probably a beastly bore. I'm not going. Nonsense, Edmund. I am going, and you are coming with me. That's settled. Archie, listen to this, Mrs. Easterbrook said to her husband. Colonel Easterbrook paid no attention, because he was already snorting with impatience over an article in the Times. Trouble with these fellows is, none of them knows the first thing about India. Not the first thing. I know, dear, I know. If they did, they wouldn't write such piffle. No, I know, Archie. Now do listen. A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October the 29th, that's today, at Little Paddocks, 6:30 p.m. Friends, please accept this, the only intimation. So what? It'll be a murder game. Oh, that's all it is. Mind you, he unbent a little. It can be very good fun if it's well done, but it needs good organising by someone who knows the ropes. What you do, you see, is you draw lots. Then one person's the murderer, nobody knows who, of course, and lights out, murderer chooses his victim. The victim has to count 20 before he screams. Then the person who's chosen to be the detective takes charge, questions everybody, where they were, what they were doing, tries to trip the real fellow up. Yes, it's a good game. If the detective knows something about police work. Like you, Archie, you had all those interesting cases to try in your district. Colonel Easterbrook smiled indulgently and gave his moustache a complacent twirl. Yes, Laura, I dare say I could give him a hint or two. Then he straightened his shoulders. Miss Blacklock ought to have asked you to help her in setting the thing up. Well, she's got that young cub staying with her. Expect this is his idea. nephew or something. Funny idea, though, sticking it in the paper. In the personal column, too. I mean, we might never have seen it. I suppose it is an invitation, Archie? Funny kind of invitation. I can tell you one thing, they can count me out. Oh, Archie! Short notice. For all they know, I might be busy. But you're not, darling. And I do think, Archie, that you really ought to go. I mean, just to help poor Miss Blacklock out. I'm sure she's counting on you to make the thing a success. I mean, you know so much about police work and procedure. The whole thing will fall flat if you don't go and help make it a success. After all, one must be neighbourly, eh? Mrs. Easterbrook put her synthetic blonde head on one side and opened her blue eyes very wide. Well, if you put it like that, Laura. The Colonel twirled his grey moustache again, importantly, and looked with indulgence on his fluffy little wife. Mrs. Easterbrook was at least 30 years younger than her husband. Well, if you put it like that, Laura. I really think it's your duty, Archie. And it will be interesting. The Chipping Cleghorn Gazette had been delivered too at Boulders, the picturesque 3 cottages knocked into one, inhabited by Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd. Hinch? What is it, Murgatroyd? Where are you? Hen house. Oh. Padding gingerly through the long wet grass, Miss Amy Murgatroyd approached her friend. The latter, attired in corduroy slacks and battle-dress tunic, was conscientiously stirring in handfuls of balancer meal to a repellently steaming basin full of cooked potato peelings and cabbage stumps. She turned her head with its short man-like crop and weather-beaten countenance towards her friend. Miss Murgatroyd, who was fat and amiable, wore a checked tweed skirt and a shapeless pullover of brilliant royal blue. Her curly bird's nest of grey hair was in a good deal of disorder, and she was slightly out of breath. In the Gazette. Just listen. What can it mean? A murder is announced, and will take place on Friday, October the 29th, at Little Paddocks, at 6:30 p.m. Friends, please accept this, the only intimation. She paused, breathless, as she finished reading, and awaited some authoritative pronouncement. Daft, said Miss Hinchcliffe. Yes, but what do you think it means? It means a drink, anyway. You think it's a sort of invitation? Well, we'll find out what it means when we get there. Bad sherry, I expect. You'd better get off the grass, Murgatroyd. You've got your bedroom slippers on still. They're soaked. Oh, dear. How many eggs today? 7. That damned hen's still broody. I must get her into the coop. It's a funny way of putting it, don't you think? Amy Murgatroyd reverted to the notice in the Gazette. Her voice was slightly wistful, but her friend was made of sterner and more single-minded stuff. She was intent on dealing with the recalcitrant poultry, and no announcement in a paper, however enigmatic, could deflect her. She squelched heavily through the mud and pounced upon a speckled hen. There was a loud and indignant squawking. "Give me ducks any time," said Miss Hinchcliffe. "Far less trouble." "Oh, scrumptious!" said Mrs. Harmon across the breakfast table to her husband, the Reverend Julian Harmon. "There's going to be a murder at Miss Blacklock's." "A murder? When?" "This afternoon. Well, at least this evening, 6:30. Oh, bad luck, darling, you've got preparations for confirmation, then. That is a shame, and you do so love murders." "I don't really know what you're talking about, Bunch." Mrs. Harmon, the roundness of whose form and face had early led to the sobriquet of Bunch being substituted for her baptismal name of Diana, handed the Gazette across the table. "There, all among the second-hand pianos and the old teeth." "What an extraordinary announcement." "Isn't it? You wouldn't think Miss Blacklock cared about murders and games and things, would you? I suppose it's the young Simmonses have put her up to it. Oh, I would have thought Julia Simmons would find murders rather crude. Well, still, there it is. And I do think, darling, it's a shame you can't be there. Anyway, I shall go. I'll tell you all about it. Though it's all rather wasted on me, because I don't really like games that happen in the dark. They frighten me. Oh, and I do hope I won't be the one who's murdered. If somebody suddenly puts a hand on my shoulder and whispers, 'You're dead,' I know my heart will give such a big bump that perhaps it really might kill me. Do you think that's likely?" "No, Bunch. I think you're going to live to be an old, old woman with me." "And die on the same day, and be buried in the same grave. Oh, that would be lovely." Bunch beamed from ear to ear at this agreeable prospect. "You seem very happy, Bunch." "Well, who'd not be happy if they were me?" demanded Bunch, rather confusedly. "With you and Susan and Edward, and all of you fond of me and not caring if I'm stupid, and the sun's shining, and this lovely big house to live in." The Reverend Julian Harmon looked round the big bare dining room and assented doubtfully. "Some people would think it was the last straw to have to live in a great rambling, draughty place." "Well, I like big rooms. All the nice smells from outside can get in and stay there. And you can be untidy and leave things about, and they don't clutter you. No labour-saving devices or central heating. It means a lot of work for you, Bunch." "Oh, Julian, it doesn't. I get up at 6:30 and light the boiler and then rush around like a steam engine, so by 8 it's all done. I keep it nice, don't I? With beeswax and polish and big jars of autumn leaves. It's not really harder to keep a big house clean than a small one. You go round with mops and things much quicker because your behind isn't always bumping into things like it is in a small room. And I like sleeping in a big cold room, because it's so cosy to snuggle down with just the tip of your nose telling you what it's like up above. And whatever size of house you live in, you peel the same amount of potatoes and wash up the same amount of plates and all that. Think how nice it is for Edward and Susan to have a big empty room to play in where they can have their railways and dolls' tea parties all over the floor, never having to put them away. And then it's nice to have extra bits of a house that you can let people have to live in, like Jimmy Symes and Johnny Finch. They'd have to live with their in-laws otherwise. And you know, Julian, it isn't nice living with your in-laws. You're devoted to your mother, I know, but you wouldn't really have liked to start our married life living with her and father. And I shouldn't have liked it either. I'd have gone on feeling like a little girl." "You're rather like a little girl still, Bunch." Julian smiled at her. Julian Harmon himself had clearly been a model designed by nature for the age of 60, and he was still about 25 years short of achieving nature's purpose. "I know I'm stupid." "You are not stupid, Bunch. You're very clever." "I'm not. Not intellectually. Though I do try, and I really love it when you talk to me about books and history and things. I think perhaps it wasn't an awfully good idea to read about Gibbon to me aloud in the evenings, because it's been a cold wind out, and it's nice and hot by the fire, and there's something about Gibbon that does rather make you go to sleep. But I love listening to you, Julian. Tell me the stories again about the old vicar who preached about Agatha." "Oh, you know that by heart, Bunch." "I know, but just tell me again, please." "Oh, well, it was old Scrimmager. Somebody looked into his church one day. He was leaning out of a pulpit and preaching fervently to a couple of old charwomen. He was shaking his finger at them and saying, 'Aha! I know what you're thinking. You think the great Hesperus of the first lesson was Artaxerxes the second. But he wasn't.' And then with enormous triumph, 'He was Artaxerxes the third.'" It had never struck Julian Harmon as a particularly funny story himself, but it never failed to amuse Bunch. Her clear laugh floated out. "Oh, the old pet. I think you'll be exactly like him one day, Julian." "Really?" Julian looked rather uneasy. "I know," he said with humility. "I do feel very strongly that I can't always get the proper, simple approach." "Well, I shouldn't worry," said Bunch, rising and beginning to pile the breakfast plates on a tray. "Mrs. Butt told me yesterday that Butt, who never went to church and used to be practically the local atheist, comes every Sunday now on purpose to hear you preach." She went on with a fair imitation of Mrs. Butt's super-refined voice. "And Butt was saying only the other day, madam, to Mr. Timkins from Little Warsdale, that we've got real culture here in Chipping Cleghorn, not like Mr. Goss at Little Warsdale, who talks to the congregation as though they were children who hadn't had any education. Real culture, Butt said. That's what we've got. Our vicar's a highly educated gentleman, Oxford, not Milchester, and he gives us the full benefit of his education. All about the Romans and the Greeks he knows, and the Babylonians and the Assyrians too. And even the vicarage cat, Butt says, is called after an Assyrian king. So there's glory for you." "Oh, goodness. I must get on with things or I shall never get done. Come along, Tiglath-Pileser. You shall have the herringbones." Opening the door and holding it dexterously ajar with her foot, she shot through with a loaded tray, singing in a loud and not particularly tuneful voice her own version of a sporting song. "It's a fine murdering day, and as balmy as May, and the sleuths from the village are gone." A rattle of crockery being dumped in the sink drowned the next lines, but as the Reverend Julian Harmon left the house, he heard the final triumphant assertion, "And we'll all go a-murdering today." At Little Paddock's also breakfast was in progress. Miss Blacklock, a woman of 60-odd, the owner of the house, sat at the head of the table. She wore country tweeds, and with them, rather incongruously, a choker necklace of large false pearls. She was reading Lane Norcott in the Daily Mail. Julia Simmons was languidly glancing through the Telegraph. Patrick Simmons was checking up on the crossword in the Times. Miss Dora Bunner was giving her attention wholeheartedly to the local weekly paper. Miss Blacklock gave a subdued chuckle. Patrick muttered, "Adherent, not adhesive. That's where I went wrong." Suddenly, a loud cluck, like a startled hen, came from Miss Bunner. Letty! Have you seen this? Whatever can it mean?" "What's the matter, Dora?" "The most extraordinary advertisement. It says Little Paddocks quite distinctly. Whatever can it mean?" "Well, if you'd let me see, Dora dear." Miss Bunner obediently surrendered the paper into Miss Blacklock's outstretched hand, pointing to the item with a tremulous forefinger. "Just look, Letty." Miss Blacklock looked. Her eyebrows went up. She threw a quick scrutinizing glance round the table. Then she read the advertisement out loud. "A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October the 29th at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. Friends, please accept this, the only intimation." "Patrick, is it your idea?" Her eyes rested searchingly on the handsome devil-may-care face of the young man at the other end of the table. Patrick Simmons' disclaimer came quickly. "No, indeed, Aunt Letty. Whatever put that idea into your head? Why should I know anything about it?" "Because I wouldn't put it past you. I thought it might be your idea of a joke." "A joke? Nothing of the kind." "And you, Julia?" "Of course not," said Julia, looking bored. "Do you think Mrs. Hames?" Miss Bunner murmured, and looked at the empty place where someone had breakfasted earlier. "Oh, I don't think our Philippa would try and be funny," said Patrick. "She's a serious girl, she is." "And what's the idea anyway?" said Julia, yawning. "What does it mean?" Miss Blacklock said slowly, "I suppose it's some silly sort of hoax." "But why?" Dora Bunner exclaimed. "What's the point of it? It seems a very stupid sort of joke, and in very bad taste." Her flabby cheeks quivered indignantly, and her short-sighted eyes sparkled with indignation. Miss Blacklock smiled at her. "Don't work yourself up over it, Bunny. It's just somebody's idea of humour. But I do wish I knew whose." "It says today, at 6:30 p.m. What do you think is going to happen?" "Death," said Patrick in sepulchral tones. "Delicious death." "Oh!" "Be quiet, Patrick. I only meant the special cake that Mitzi makes. You know we always call it delicious death." Miss Blacklock smiled a little absent-mindedly. Miss Bunner persisted. "But Letty, what do you really think?" Her friend cut across the words with reassuring cheerfulness. "I know one thing what will happen at 6:30. We shall have half the village up here agog with curiosity. I'd better make sure we've got some sherry in the house." "You are worried, aren't you, Lottie?" Miss Blacklock started. She'd been sitting at her writing table absent-mindedly drawing little fishes on the blotting paper, and she looked up into the anxious face of her old friend. She was not quite sure what to say to Dora Bunner. Bunny, she knew, must not be worried or upset. She was silent a moment or two, thinking. She and Dora Bunner had been at school together. Dora then had been a pretty, fair-haired, blue-eyed, rather stupid girl. Her being stupid hadn't mattered because her gaiety and high spirits and prettiness had made her an agreeable companion. She ought, her friend thought, to have married some nice army officer or country solicitor. She'd had many good qualities, affection, devotion, loyalty, but life had been unkind to Dora Bunner. She had had to earn her living, and she had been painstaking, but never competent at anything she undertook. The two friends had lost sight of each other, but 6 months ago a letter came to Miss Blacklock, a rambling, pathetic letter, that Dora's health had given way. She was living in one room, trying to subsist on her old-age pension. She endeavoured to do needlework, but her fingers were stiff with rheumatism. She mentioned their school days. Since then, life had driven them apart. But could, possibly, her old friend help? Miss Blacklock had responded impulsively. Poor Dora, poor silly fluffy Dora. She'd swooped down upon Dora and carried her off, installed her at Little Paddocks with the comforting fiction that the housework is getting too much for me, so I need someone to help run the house. It was not for long, the doctor had told her that. But sometimes she found poor old Dora a sad trial. Upset the temperamental foreign help, miscounted the laundry, lost bills and letters, and sometimes reduced the competent Miss Blacklock to an agony of exasperation. Poor old muddle-headed Dora, so loyal, so anxious to help, so pleased and proud to think she was of assistance, and alas, so completely unreliable. She said sharply, "Don't, Dora. Now you know I asked you—" "Oh!" Miss Bunner looked guilty. "I know, I forgot, but you aren't you worried?" "No." "Well, at least, not exactly. You mean about that silly notice in the Gazette?" "Yes. Even if it's a joke, it seems to me— well, it's a spiteful sort of joke." "Spiteful?" "Yes. It seems to me there is spite in there somewhere. I mean, it's not a nice kind of joke." Miss Blacklock looked at her friend. The mild eyes, the long obstinate mouth, the slightly upturned nose. Poor Dora, so maddening, so muddle-headed, so devoted, and such a problem. A dear, fussy old idiot, and yet, in a queer way, with an instinctive sense of values. "I think you're right, Dora. It is not a nice joke." "I don't like it at all. It frightens me," said Dora, with unexpected vigour. She added suddenly, "And it frightens you, Letitia." "Nonsense! It's dangerous, I'm sure it is. Like those people who send bombs done up in parcels." "My dear, it's just some silly idiot trying to be funny." "But it isn't funny." "Well, it wasn't really very funny." Miss Blacklock's face betrayed her thoughts, and Dora cried triumphantly, "You see! You think so too!" "But Dora, my dear—" She broke off. Through the door there surged a tempestuous young woman with a well-developed bosom heaving under a tight jersey. She had on a drindle skirt of bright colour, and had greasy dark plaits wound round and round her head. Her eyes were dark and flashing. She said gustily, "I can speak to you, yes, please, no?" Miss Blacklock sighed. "Of course, Mitzi. What is it?" Sometimes she thought it would be preferable to do the entire work of the house as well as the cooking, rather than be bothered with the eternal nerve-storms of her refugee lady help. "I tell you at once, it is in order, I hope, for I give you notices. I go, at once." "For what reason? Has somebody upset you?" "Yes, I am upset. I do not wish to die. Already in Europe I escape. My family, they all die, they are all killed. My mother, my little brother, my so sweet little niece, all killed. Me, I run away, I hide, I get to England, I work. I do work that never would I do in my own country. I know all that," said Miss Blacklock crisply. It was indeed a constant refrain on Mitzi's lips. "But why do you want to leave now?" "Because again they come to kill me." "Who do?" "My enemies, the Nazis, or perhaps this time the Bolsheviks. They find out I am here, they have come to kill me, I read it. Yes, I read it in the newspaper." "Oh, you mean the Gazette? Here, it is written, here." Mitzi produced the Gazette from where she'd been holding it behind her back. "See, here it says murder at Little Paddocks. That is here, is it not? This evening at 6:30? I do not wait to be murdered. No." "But why should this apply to you?" We think it's a joke." "A joke? It is not a joke to murder someone." "No, of course not. But, my dear child, if anyone wanted to murder you, they wouldn't advertise the fact in the paper, would they?" "You do not think they would?" She seemed a little shaken. "You think perhaps they do not mean to murder anyone at all?" Or perhaps it is you they mean to murder, Miss Blacklock." "I certainly can't believe anybody wants to murder me. And really, Mitzi, I do not see why anyone should want to murder you. After all, why should they?" "Because they're bad peoples, very bad peoples. I tell you, my mother, my little brother, my so sweet niece, yes, yes, but I cannot believe anyone wants to murder you, Mitzi. Now, of course, if you want to go off like this at a moment's notice, I can't possibly stop you, but I think you will be very silly if you do," she added firmly as Mitzi looked doubtful. "We'll have that beef the butcher sent stewed for lunch. It looks very tough." "I make you goulash, a special goulash." "Well, if you prefer to call it that, certainly. And perhaps you would use up that rather hard bit of cheese in making some cheese straws. I think some people may come this evening for drinks." "This evening? What do you mean, this evening?" "At 6:30. "The time in the paper! Why should they come then? Why should they come?" "Well, they're coming to the funeral," said Miss Blacklock with a twinkle. "That'll do, Mitzi. I'm busy. Shut the door after you." "That settled her for the moment," she said, as the door closed behind a puzzled-looking Mitzi. "You're so efficient, Letty," said Miss Bunner admiringly. "Well, here we are, all set." Miss Blacklock looked around the double drawing-room with an appraising eye. The rose-patterned chintzes, the 2 bowls of bronze chrysanthemums, the small vase of violets, and the silver cigarette-box on a table by the wall, the tray of drinks on the centre table. Yes, it all looked satisfactory. Little Paddock's was a medium-sized house built in the early Victorian style. It had a long, shallow veranda and green-shuttered windows. The long, narrow drawing-room, which lost a good deal of light owing to the veranda roof, had originally had double doors at one end, leading to a small room with a bay window. A former generation had removed the double doors and replaced them with portieres of velvet. Miss Blacklock had dispensed with the portieres, so that the 2 rooms had become definitely one. There was a fireplace each end, but neither fire was lit, although a gentle warmth pervaded the room. "You've had the central heating lit," said Patrick. Miss Blacklock nodded. "It's been so misty and damp lately. The whole house felt clammy. I got Evans to light it before he went." "The precious, precocious coke." "As you say, the precious coke. But otherwise there would have been the even more precious coal. You know the fuel office won't even let us have the little bit that's due to us each week. Not unless we can say definitely we haven't got any other means of cooking." "I suppose there was once heaps of coal and coke for everybody," said Julia, with the interest of one hearing about an unknown country. "Yes, and cheap too." "And anyone could go and buy as much as they wanted without filling in anything, and there wasn't any shortage. There was lots of it, was there? All kinds and qualities. Not all stones and slates like we get nowadays. It must have been a wonderful world." "Well, looking back on it, I certainly think it was. But I'm an old woman. It's natural for me to prefer my times. You young things oughtn't to think so." "I needn't have had a job then," said Julia. "I could just have stayed at home and done the flowers, and written notes." "Why did one write notes? Who were they for?" "For all the people that you now ring up on the telephone," said Miss Blacklock with a twinkle. "I don't believe you know how to write, Julia." "Not in the style of that delicious complete letter writer I found the other day. Heavenly! It told you the correct way to refuse a proposal of marriage from a widower." "I doubt if you would have enjoyed staying at home as much as you think," said Miss Blacklock. "There were duties, you know. However, I don't really know much about it. Bunny and I," she smiled affectionately at Dora Bunner, "we went into the labour market early." "Oh, we did indeed," agreed Miss Bunner. "Those naughty, naughty children, I shall never forget them. Of course, Letty was clever. She was a businesswoman, secretary to a big financier." The door opened and Philippa Hames came in. She was tall and fair and placid-looking. She looked around the room in surprise. "Hello, is it a party? Nobody told me." "Of course," cried Patrick. "Our Philippa doesn't know. The only woman in Chipping Cleghorn who doesn't." "What do you mean?" "Here, behold this." He waved his arm dramatically round the room. "The scene of a murder." Philippa Hames looked faintly puzzled. "Here," Patrick indicated the 2 big bowls of chrysanthemums, "are the funeral wreaths, and these dishes of cheese, straws, and olives represent the funeral baked meats." Philippa looked inquiringly at Miss Blacklock. "Is it a joke? I'm always terribly stupid at seeing jokes." "It is a very nasty joke," said Dora Bunner with energy. "I don't like it at all." "Show her the advertisement," said Miss Blacklock. "I must go and shut up the ducks. It's dark, and they'll be in by now." "Oh, let me do it," said Philippa. "Certainly not, my dear. You finished your day's work." "I'll do it, Aunt Letty," offered Patrick. "No, you won't," said Miss Blacklock with energy. "Last time you didn't latch the door properly." "Oh, I'll do it, Letty dear. Indeed, I should love to. I'll just slip on my goloshes. Oh, now, where did I put my cardigan?" Miss Blacklock, with a smile, had already left the room. "It's no good, Bunny. Aunt Letty's so efficient she can never bear anybody to do things for her. She really much prefers to do it all herself." "She loves it," said Julia. "I didn't notice you making any offers of assistance," said her brother. Julia smiled lazily. "You've just said Aunt Letty likes to do things herself. Besides," she held out a well-shaped leg in a sheer stocking, "I've got my best stockings on." "Death in silk stockings." "Not silk, nylons, you idiot." "It's a good title, though." "Won't somebody please tell me," cried Philippa plaintively, "why there is all this insistence on death?" Everybody tried to tell her at once. Nobody could find the Gazette, because Mitzi had taken it into the kitchen. Miss Blacklock returned a few minutes later. "There, that's done. 6:20. Somebody ought to be here soon, unless, of course, I am entirely wrong in my estimate of my neighbours." "I don't see why anybody's coming," said Philippa, looking bewildered. "Don't you, dear? I dare say you wouldn't, but most people are more inquisitive than you are. Philippa's attitude to life is that she just isn't interested," said Julia, rather nastily. Philippa did not reply. Miss Blacklock was glancing round the room. Mitzi had put the sherry and 3 dishes containing olives, cheese straws, and some little fancy pastries on the table in the middle of the room. "You might move that tray, or the whole table if you like, round the corner into the bay window at the other room. Would you, Patrick? After all, I'm not giving a party. I haven't asked anyone, and I don't intend to make it obvious that I expect people to turn up." "You wish, Aunt Letty, to disguise your intelligent anticipation." "Very nicely put, Patrick. Thank you, dear boy." "Now we can all give a lovely performance of a quiet evening at home," said Julia, "and be quite surprised when somebody drops in." Miss Blacklock had picked up the sherry bottle, and she stood holding it uncertainly in her hand. Patrick reassured her. "There's quite half a bottle there. It ought to be enough." "Yes, but—" "Oh, Patrick, would you mind? There's a new bottle in the cupboard in the pantry. Bring it in a corkscrew. Well, we might as well have a new bottle. This hasn't been opened for some time." Patrick went on his errand without a word, and returned with the new bottle and drew the cork. He looked up curiously at Miss Blacklock as he placed it on the tray. "You're taking this seriously, aren't you, darling?" Dora Bunner looked shocked. "Oh, surely, Letty, you don't imagine—" "Hush! That's the bell. You see, my intelligent anticipation is being justified." Mitzi opened the door of the drawing-room and admitted Colonel and Mrs. Easterbrook. She had her own methods of announcing people. "Is Colonel and Mrs. Easterbrook to see you?" Colonel Easterbrook was very bluff and breezy to cover the slight embarrassment he felt. "I hope you don't mind us dropping in." A subdued gurgle from Julia. "Happened to be passing this way. Quite a mild evening. Notice you've had your central heating on. We haven't started ours yet." "Aren't your chrysanthemums lovely?" gushed Mrs. Easterbrook. "Such beauties!" "They're rather scraggy, really," said Julia. Mrs. Easterbrook greeted Philippa Hames with a little extra cordiality, to show that she quite understood that Philippa was not really an agricultural labourer. "How is Mrs. Lucas's garden getting on? Do you think it'll ever be straight again? Completely neglected all through the war, and then only that dreadful old man Ash, who simply didn't do anything but sweep up a few leaves and put in a few cabbage plants. It's yielding to treatment, but it'll take a little time," said Philippa. Mitzi opened the door again. "It's the ladies from Boulders." "Evening," said Miss Hinchcliffe, striding over and taking Miss Blacklock's hand in a formidable grip. "I said to Murgatroyd, let's just drop in at Little Paddocks, because I want to know if your ducks are laying." "The evenings do draw in so quickly now, don't they?" said Miss Murgatroyd to Patrick in a rather fluttery way. "What lovely chrysanthemums!" "Scraggy," said Julia. "Why can't you be cooperative?" "You had your central heating on." "Very early?" "Well, the house gets so damp this time of year," said Miss Blacklock. Patrick signalled with his eyebrows. "Sherry yet?" Miss Blacklock signalled back. "Not yet." "Colonel Easterbrook, are you getting any bulbs from Holland this year?" The door opened again, and Mrs. Swettenham came in rather guiltily, followed by a scowling and uncomfortable Edward. "Here we are," said Mrs. Swettenham gaily, gazing round the room with frank curiosity. Then, feeling suddenly uncomfortable, she went on, "I just thought I'd pop in and ask you if by any chance you wanted a kitten, Miss Blacklock. Our cat is just about to be brought to bed of a progeny of a ginger Tom," said Edmund. "The result will, I think, be frightful. Do not say you've not been warned." "She's a very good mouse, sir. What lovely chrysanthemums!" "Got your central heating on early, haven't you?" asked Edmund with an air of originality. "Aren't people just like gramophone records?" muttered Julia. "I don't like the news," said Colonel Easterbrook to Patrick, buttonholing him fiercely. "I do not like it at all. If you ask me, war is inevitable, absolutely inevitable." "I never pay any attention to news." Once more the door opened, and Mrs. Harmon came in. Her battered felt hat was stuck on the back of her head in a vague attempt to be fashionable, and she'd put on a rather limp frilly blouse instead of her usual pullover. "Hello, Miss Blacklock," she exclaimed, beaming all over her round face. "I'm not too late, am I? When does the murder begin?" There was an audible series of gasps. Julia gave an approving little giggle. Patrick crinkled up his face, and Miss Blacklock smiled at her latest guest. "Julian's frantic with rage he can't be here. He adores murders," went on Mrs. Harmon. "That's really why he preached such a good sermon last Sunday. I suppose I oughtn't to say it was a good sermon, as he's my husband, but it really was good, don't you think? So much better than his usual ones. But as I was saying, it was all because of Death Does the Hat Trick. Have you read it? The girl at Boots kept it for me specially. It's simply baffling. You keep thinking you know, and then the whole thing switches round. And there's a lovely lot of murders, 4 or 5 in fact. Well, I left it in the study when Julian was shutting himself up there to do the sermon, and he just picked it up and he simply could not put it down. Consequently, he had to write his sermon in a frightful hurry, and had to just put down what he wanted to say very simply, without any scholarly twists and bits and learned references, so naturally it was heaps better. Oh dear, I'm talking too much. Oh, do tell me when's the murder going to begin?" Miss Blacklock looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. "If it's going to begin, it ought to begin soon. It's just a minute to the half hour. In the meantime, do have a glass of sherry." Patrick moved with alacrity through the archway. Miss Blacklock went to the table by the archway where the cigarette box was. "Oh, I'd love some sherry," said Mrs. Harmon. "But what do you mean by if?" "Well," said Miss Blacklock, "I'm as much in the dark as you are. I don't know what—" She stopped and turned her head as the little clock by the mantelpiece began to chime. It had a sweet silvery bell-like tone. Everybody was silent, and nobody moved. They all stared at the clock. It chimed a quarter, and then the half. As the last note died away, all the lights went out. Delighted gasps and feminine squeaks of appreciation were heard in the darkness. "It's beginning!" cried Mrs. Harmon in ecstasy. Dora Bunner's voice cried out plaintively, "Oh, I don't like it!" Other voices said, "How terribly, terribly frightening! It gives me the creeps. Archie, where are you? What do I have to do? Oh dear, did I step on your foot? I'm so sorry." Then, with a crash, the door swung open. A powerful flashlight played rapidly round the room. A man's hoarse nasal voice, reminiscent to all of pleasant afternoons in the cinema, directed the company crisply to "Stick 'em up, I tell you!" Delightedly, hands were raised willingly above heads. "Isn't it wonderful?" breathed a female voice. "I'm so thrilled." And then, unexpectedly, a revolver spoke. It spoke twice. A ping of 2 bullets shattered the complacency of the room. Suddenly, the game was no longer a game. Somebody screamed. The figure in the doorway whirled suddenly round. It seemed to hesitate, and a third shot rang out, and then it crumpled and crashed to the ground. The flashlight dropped and went out. There was darkness once again. And gently, with a little Victorian protesting moan, the drawing-room door, as was its habit when not propped open, swung gently to and latched with a click. Inside the drawing-room was pandemonium. Various voices spoke at once. "Lights! Can't find the switch! Who's got a lighter? Oh dear, I don't like it, I don't like it! Those shots, they were real! It was a real revolver he had! Was it a burglar? Oh, Archie, I want to get out of here! Please, has somebody got a lighter?" And then, almost at the same time, 2 lighters clicked and burned with steady flames. Everybody blinked and peered at each other. Startled face looked into startled face. Against the wall by the archway, Miss Blacklock stood with her hand to her face. The light was too dim to show more than something dark was trickling over her fingers. Colonel Easterbrook cleared his throat and rose to the occasion. "Try the switches, Swetnam." Edmund, near the door, obediently jerked the switch up and down. "Off at the mains, or a fuse," said the Colonel. "Who's making that awful row?" A female voice had been screaming steadily from somewhere beyond the closed door. It rose now in pitch, and with it came a sound of fists hammering on the door. Dora Bunner, who had been sobbing quietly, called out, "It's Mitzi! Somebody's murdering Mitzi!" Patrick muttered, "No such luck." Miss Blacklock said, "We must get candles. Patrick, will you?" The Colonel was already opening the door. He and Edmund, their lights flickering, stepped into the hall. They almost stumbled over a recumbent figure there. "Seems to have knocked him out. Where's that woman making that hellish noise?" "She's in the dining room." The dining room was just across the hall. Someone was beating on the panels and howling and screaming. "She's locked in," said Edmund, stooping down. He turned the key, and Mitzi came out like a bounding tiger. The dining room light was still on. Silhouetted against it, Mitzi presented a figure of insane terror and continued to scream. A touch of comedy was introduced by the fact that she'd been engaged in cleaning silver and was still holding a chamois lever and a large fish slice. "Be quiet, Mitzi," said Miss Blacklock. "Stop it," said Edmund. And as Mitzi showed no disposition to stop screaming, he leaned forward and gave her a sharp slap on the cheek. Mitzi gasped and hiccuped into silence. "Do get some candles," said Miss Blacklock. "In the kitchen cupboard. Patrick, you know where the fuse box is." "The passage behind the scullery, right. I'll see what I can do." Miss Blacklock had moved forward into the light thrown from the dining room, and Dora Bunner gave a sobbing gasp. Mitzi let out another full-blooded scream. "The blood! The blood! You're shot, Miss Blacklock! You bleed to death!" "Don't be so stupid. I'm hardly hurt at all. It just grazed my ear." "But Aunt Letty," said Julia, "the blood!" And indeed Miss Blacklock's white blouse and pearls and her hands were a horrifying, gory sight. "Ears always bleed. I remember fainting in the hairdresser's when I was a child. A man had only just snipped my ear. There seemed to be a basin of blood at once. But we must have some light. I get candles." Julia went with her, and they returned with several candles stuck into saucers. "Now let's have a look at our malefactor. Hold the candles down low and sweeten them, as many as you can." "I'll come the other side," said Philippa. With a steady hand she took a couple of saucers. Colonel Easterbrook knelt down. The recumbent figure was draped in a roughly made black cloak with a hood. There was a black mask over the face, and he wore black cotton gloves. The hood had slipped back, disclosing a ruffled fair head. The Colonel turned him over, felt the pulse, the heart, then drew away his fingers with an exclamation of distaste. They were sticky red. "Shot himself." "Is he badly hurt?" asked Miss Blacklock. "Yes. I'm afraid he's dead. May have been suicide, or he could have tripped up on that cloak thing and the revolver went off. If I could see better." At that moment, as though by magic, the lights came on again. With a queer feeling of unreality, those inhabitants of Chipping Cleghorn who stood in the hall of Little Paddocks realized that they stood in the presence of violent and sudden death. Colonel Easterbrook's hand was stained red. Blood was still trickling down Miss Blacklock's neck over her blouse and coat, and the grotesquely sprawled figure of the intruder lay at their feet. Patrick, coming from a dining room, said, "It seemed to be just one fuse gone." He stopped. Colonel Easterbrook tugged at the small black mask. "Better see who the fellow is. I don't suppose it's anyone we know." Necks were craned forward. Mitzi hiccuped and gasped. The others were very quiet. "He's quite young," said Mrs. Harmon, with a note of pity in her voice. And suddenly Dora Bunner cried out excitedly, "Letty! Letty! It's the young man from the Spa Hotel in Meddenham Wells. The one who came here and wanted you to give him money to get back to Switzerland, and you refused. I suppose the whole thing was just a pretext to spy out the house. Oh, dear! He might easily have killed you." Miss Blacklock, in command of the situation, said incisively, "Philippa, take Bunny into the dining room and give her a half-glass of brandy. Julia, dear, run up to the bathroom and bring me a sticking plaster from the bathroom cupboard. It's so messy, bleeding like a pig. Patrick, will you ring up the police at once?"